This is Troy, and you are listening to Revived Thoughts. This week, I am by myself. Joel is traveling, and he works as a missions videographer. If you don't know that, he got the opportunity to record some missionaries and do some work with them. That's wonderful and great, and they got to travel to do that, and took them a few weeks out, so they was not able to be on the episode this week. However, that is okay. I had a subject I wanted to talk to everyone about anyway. And sometimes I get to do this. The last time I got to do this, where it was just kind of me on the show, I just kind of gave a story. Stories that don't normally fit into the flow of the show. I usually, as you know, Revive Thoughts, we take sermons of the past and bring them back to life. And you can listen to the backstory of that preacher and you listen to the sermon. And then sometimes we'll do revived conversations where we talk about a topic and we kind of go back and forth on it, like our most recent church history conferences one, which was a bit controversial. And this topic I had today was originally going to be a deep dive, which is our very long ones where we do multiple hours on something and we talk about it a lot. And we really do. We do. If you haven't listened to those, usually they're for the Patreons, but eventually they do make it to the public feed. But we do ask if you want to listen, join us on Patreon so you can listen. It's not a ton of money. And it does help support the show if you do. And you get to listen to them early. We have a Typing Rebellion episode that should honestly be coming out any day now. So that would be great for the Patreons. We'll get the opportunity to listen to that. But if you haven't listened, go check out the London Fire episode. You may wonder why would I want to listen to something about a fire in London. But I promise you, people who listen to it, we had several people who comment and go, man, how is this not a book? I've never heard this story before. And that's what our deep dives usually are, stories you've never heard before. Typing Rebellion and the Ethiopian history and just stuff, or stories maybe you know a little bit about, like Joan of Arc, the First Crusade, or the Salem Witch Trials, but told at a very deep level. So you really come out of it, I think, understanding. And this episode really isn't any of those. This is much more like our Woodrow Wilson part 1 and 2. The last time I was by myself, I had a story I wanted to tell. There was another one we did too. It was called it's something like Monster or something. It's a really good episode. We had a lot of people love that one too. It's Preaching the Gospel to Monsters or something like that from 2 years ago. And these are the stories that I can't really fit into the normal flow of Revive Thoughts with the sermons, but there's still things that I think we should talk about. And they're really, in my opinion, interesting parts of church history that don't get explored very often. But I didn't want to do a deep dive on this one. I'm actually glad this opportunity came up because it was on my list. It was going to be the next one we did after the Typing Rebellion was going to be the French Revolution. But if I'm honest, even you probably hearing just the words French Revolution, you just teleported back to high school history class and being bored probably as someone droned on and on and on and a bunch of French names went by and you just didn't understand it. And that's how I feel about it, and I've had to teach it, and I understand the French Revolution. There's just something about teaching that subject that just doesn't interest a lot of us. I mean, maybe you're a big French Revolution guy, and you found this podcast from this. You couldn't wait to find more French Revolution talk. But I think most of us, when we hear the French Revolution, our eyes dull over, we glaze over, and we are back in that history class that we didn't find very interesting. And I actually think this episode, to me, explained why, without realizing that there's been a piece of the French Revolution that's been hidden from us. And when I discovered this recently, actually completely by accident, but when I discovered this, I went, oh my goodness, that is, I think, what's missing, or at least a big part of what's missing in our understanding of the French Revolution. If I can just do a very short summary, start the clock, 1 minute, I think I can do this. The French people were upset with their king. They wanted to overthrow them. They had been, milked all these ideas of Enlightenment thinking, and they overthrew their king. Some people say the king was really bad. Other people say, actually, this particular king wasn't that bad, but maybe the taste of the old King Louis XIV, the Sun King, was in their eyes, and they overthrew the king. The mobs went crazy. Soon they were killing everybody. Then they were killing rich people, and then they started killing themselves. And then a guy named Robespierre took over, and he started killing everybody. But then he died, and then nobody was in charge. And a bunch of governments came and went. And then by the end of it, Napoleon takes over and starts a war with everyone. And Napoleon, for me, I think a lot of us, is when the story gets interesting. Like this guy who's a soldier rises through the ranks on his own talents and leads the way. And that's the half that's interesting. The first half is just so confusing. It's hard to be interested, in my opinion, by it. And yet, I will say, after I worked on this episode today, I was like, this is the piece we've been missing. This is the story of the French Revolution that hasn't been told to us yet, or at least was not told to me. And when I learned this, it made me much more interested in the French Revolution because it makes more sense. There's been an element missing, and that element, in my opinion, is the faith. Where and why did a bunch of Christians in France, because this is about, only 150 years after, about actually 200 and something years. It's after the Reformation, but this is supposed, and France is Catholic, so let's make that clear. France is Catholic. If you listen to Elise's episode on the Huguenots, which were French Protestants and martyrs and missionaries, France was going after Protestants all over the world. France was not a part of the Reformation, but France should have been a somewhat Christian country. What happened here that led to this madness and this mob? And we're going to look at that, and I think when we go through this story, we will understand it. One way to look at this story I had heard this a long time ago. There was this kind of beginning idea, there's this conversation that did happen. We don't know exactly what was said, but there was a conversation between three different people. It starts with Thomas Paine. And Thomas Paine is the author of Common Sense. He was one of the most influential people in the American Revolution. His pamphlets and words helped get America going. His encouragement during America's darkest days were a very pivotal part of the revolution. And he would write, we don't need, I can't remember the exact phrasing, but we don't need sunshine soldiers, but we need men who go through the winter. He was out there encouraging the soldiers to keep fighting for what America was going to be during the American Revolution. And he gets into an argument with George Washington, President of the United States, and basically says, why are we not sending soldiers and supporting the revolution in France? France had our back and helped us fight for liberty. Why is America not going to get her back and to support her during her own revolution? And Thomas Jefferson was the other person in the room, and he was siding with George Washington because he was his boss, but he's the signer of the Declaration of Independence, or all that. He's the guy. He's all about liberty and justice for all. Why aren't we going to help out France? Why didn't we send our soldiers? But George Washington was firm with Thomas Paine. He said, it is not the same revolution. We will not get a part of it. And Thomas Paine kind of bitterly yells and shouts out, I will not leave them alone. I will go to France and help them. I can't believe America would turn their back on this cry for freedom. And then, he got personal with George. He was basically, I can't believe you turned your back on them during this moment. And George Washington told him, you are free to go. It's a free country, right? But we will not save you. If you get imprisoned or in trouble in France, America will not send soldiers, will not put pressure on France. You are going outside of our protection as an American citizen, and you take this risk on your own. And Thomas Paine left in a fury. He was mad. And this was the last time he would ever be in the room of either Thomas Jefferson or George Washington. Thomas Paine will arrive in France. He will fight for the revolution. At one point, he will be placed in jail. And he believes he's going to die in that jail, where he will scribble down the notes of paper of a book he's been working on God during that time in prison. He writes it down, fearful that he will be executed before his great book is written. And it's a good reason that he thought he would be, because in 1793, the executioner went past every single door that was going to be in that prison that he was in and put a mark on the door where the inhabitant was. If they got that mark, that meant they would be executed. And Paine got that mark on his door, which meant that he should have died. However, when they marked his door, he had visitors at the time. And so the way the guard had rubbed the mark on the door had been on like a slightly open door. And when the door was shut later, when the visitors were gone, when they came to get everyone who was on a marked door, his door was shut. And it was that part of it that was shut that covered up the mark. If it had not been for the slightly open door and this one, literally a door ajar with some friends over, had the guard been a slightly more careful, his door would have been marked and he would have been taken out and executed. That's how close Thomas Paine got to being executed during the French Revolution. It was a slip up of a guard marking doors with chalk and a door happening to be open that saved his life. So when he was in that moment, when he's in jail thinking, I'm going to die, he began writing a book that would eventually be called The Age of Reason. And if you have not read this book, you have not missed out on much. It is one of the most anti-God screeds you will ever read. I say this as somebody who has read it. And I will say it was not an easy book to read. I would not recommend reading it. I would say it's a book that if you're not firm in your faith, it will shake you up a bit. I was firm in my faith, and I am firm in my faith. I love Jesus Christ with all my heart, and the Bible is his inerrant word, but it did challenge me, and I read it, and I was like, these are tough questions. I had to go through, and I couldn't read alone. I had to go to commentaries and read other things. I found actually a person who responded to the book when it was published, and they would write letters back and forth. And so I read his answers to Thomas Paine's questions. I found they were very satisfactory. But it was not a book that just I felt at the time when I read it 10 years ago that I could answer all the questions that it brought up about the Bible on my own. It's a very anti-God book, and many have said it's one of the most damaging books that has ever been written to people's faith. It is just such a attack, and it just comes off like in today's world it'd be like an angry atheist Reddit page. But I mean, it is an insane attack on the Bible that really challenged and broke a lot of people's faith. And that's what he was scribbling down on pieces of paper in that jail cell. And when he realized, of course, he did eventually not get executed, he put it into a book. Now, Paine wrote a letter to George Washington while he was in France, basically hoping it would arrive on his birthday. So while France was suffering, he wrote a letter getting it to George Washington on his birthday, where he called him an apostate. You gave up on freedom. You're a military commander, but you don't deserve praise because you're deep down a coward. And this letter, he did not get a reply from it. So then he published it, basically showing to everyone. Thomas Paine was so angry. He wanted everyone to hear Washington's a loser, a coward, and he didn't stand up for France. But Washington never changed his mind, and he refused to respond to anything Paine did. He never changed his mind. He was firm on this point. What happened in France, the revolution happening in France, is not the same kind of revolution. Why? What was so different about what happened in France? Why? And to be honest, I don't know that we really think about this, but one of the biggest differences that really dawned on me was this faith aspect. When I started to learn what was going on in the religion of the people of France, I learned a bunch of stuff I'd never heard before. And then I went, this is what was different. Washington was correct. You don't see any of the stuff we're about to talk about happening in the American Revolution at all, not even close. The American Revolution, the preachers in America were preaching why they were not breaking God's law in Romans 13 and encouraging their people. Now, there are people who disagree with that, but they were very firm. We need to be by the book, and here's the reasons we are sticking with the book, even though we're rebelling. In France, nothing like that is happening. So this is going to be something we take a look at from this Christian perspective. Now, the spiritual and religious aspects of this revolution that are not often talked about, to understand it, we have to go back to the early 1700s, because it would be easy to say, wow, France just kind of loses her mind and does a bunch of weird stuff, but that's not fair to France. In the early 1700s, there was this idea of the absolute monarchies, these ideas that these kings could do whatever they wanted. And the quintessential guy who emblems that more than anybody is the guy who called himself the Sun King, King Louis XIV. Again, if you remember this in history class, it might be the part where you glaze over, but stick with me because we're going to get to the wild stuff here in a minute. King Louis XIV was in charge, and he believed he had a divine right to rule. The kings basically were told, Romans 13, everyone has to submit to you. You're the king. God put you there to rule over. So anything you do is right because you're the governing authority. Now, they should have said that you have to submit to God's laws. And to a degree, they did. Like they didn't just, murder everybody they saw or something like that. But at the same time, whatever they did was right because they were ordained by God. So they had to be listened to. And King Louis XIV really was that. Now, part of it was because when he was young, the nobles came up to him while he was still a kid, basically, and they threatened him and basically said, we will kill you. And this terrified and broke him. He never forgot about it. And when he got older, he made the nobles pay. He built the Palace of Versailles, and he made basically the nobles live there and serve him. Every morning, you had to be at breakfast. You had to be waiting. You had to be around him. If you were not in court for any reason, you were left out on the important happenings. Maybe you wouldn't get the next business deal that comes through, or maybe your family would be falling in favor because you weren't around the palace 24/7. And that's how he ran the show. He treated them, when you read how he treats them, it's almost like they're pets. Like they got to do whatever he says. They got to run with him, walk with him. If he goes for a walk, they have to follow behind him. They are literally treated like dogs. And he clearly never forgot how they treated him and how he would get back at them for it. That's the power of King Louis XIV. This is the era that these people are growing up in. And the church is enabling and a big part of why they have so much power. A man was born during this time. His name is Francois Hérol Vérol. And I am super, super, super sorry to all our French listeners. I do not speak French, and I don't know if I got that name right at all. You maybe don't know that name anyway, because his pen name is much more famous. His name is Voltaire. He was born in the late 1600s, and he would live through this time of King Louis XIV. And he saw this king who believed he was ordained by God to do whatever he wanted. He saw the power of the Catholic Church at this time in France, and he hated the church, and he hated everything about what he saw. And here's one of the problems with the French Revolution. I think it's one of the reasons why we really struggle with understanding this. The American Revolution, at least if you're American, right? America's good, Britain's bad. And I'm sure if you're a British listener, you're going, hey, well, hold up there, colonial. I understand. But the point is, there's at least kind of, in a lot of World War II, Hitler bad, America good, right? Like we got some Britain good, Russia bad. I don't know. You can have some good guys, bad guys stuff going on here. I know Russia, if you're about to write in and go, Russia was on the Allied side, remember that in the beginning, Russia was not on the Allied side. So actually, there you go. However, also, the way Russia was on the Allied side, it's not a World War II podcast. We're going to stick with what we're doing here, okay? I'm not going on that one. Sorry. However, during this time, the problem is the good guys, the people that the revolution is happening against, aren't really good guys at all. And you kind of have to side with the peasants a little bit. The Catholic Church running France at that time was doing an atrocious job. The priests were not taxable. They made absolutely tons of money. They were a part of what's, I think, called the Second Estate, the First Estate, the Third Estate. But basically, they were rich, powerful people that nobody could touch because the government protected them, and they helped protect the government. And they made money while the peasants struggled deeply under all of this. And the peasants of France were struggling, especially after the French and Indian War. They had to pay for an expensive war between France and Britain that they lost. And so not only did they not win the war, but they had to pay for the price of that, and that caused a lot of problems, whereas the peasants were struggling to afford food, yet the untaxed priests were making tons of money. The bishops were living the high life. The elites of Paris were doing just fine. And so there's a part of you where you look at all this and you go, then I can see why you'd want a revolution. I get it. The way things were going in France was terrible. And this is one of those situations where the church is going to receive irreparable harm from the French Revolution, but it was her own fault for getting involved in politics and forgetting her first duty to share Christ and to take care of the poor and do those things that God called us to do in the Bible. The church had long left that duty, and now you're seeing in some ways the comeuppance come, but it's at the expense and harm of everyone else. And so it's just a bad situation, and you wish you could go back in time and just get all of these French Christians to stop persecuting Huguenots, for starters, but then to live like Christians, help the poor, and take care of people. And it's important to note, some of them were. There were always some people who were doing those things. It's just the majority of them didn't seem to be. Now, Voltaire, this guy growing up at this time, he is an important person because he really, I won't say he's the only atheist, and he would say he's not an atheist, but he's basically your YouTube channel Angry Atheist in a sense. He's much smarter than that, but he is, right? And he's not the only one, but he's very clever in his attacks. For example, the church would censor what you could write, so he could not write direct attacks against the church. He couldn't say, the church is stealing all our money. But he found a way around that. So instead, he would say, did you hear what so-and-so said? They're saying the church is stealing all our money, and they're building all these things, and they're enjoying this, and they're making money off of us, and they just harm us. And he would write this long thing about what so-and-so said, and it would be all his true beliefs. And then he would end it with, but thank goodness we know France would never do that, or something like that. Some little pithy quote at the end to say, oh, but this, you know that is worthless. You know he's just saying that. But through that, France can't censor him because technically it's not his beliefs. And he rebuts it at the end, right? And so he came up with these clever things he could do to get away with attacking him. And that actually made him more popular because his sarcasm was so clever. He was a funny guy. And people were like, yeah, that's such a good, he was a resistance guy. And people really liked it. And again, look, I love Jesus Christ, but if I lived as a peasant in France and I saw the church that was being represented to me, and this guy was attacking them, I would be tempted. Of course, I probably couldn't read it, but I would be tempted to go with him, right? Because the church I'm seeing is not the bride of Christ as she's supposed to be. And someone out there is pointing that out. And I think that was very persuasive to a lot of people. And again, if Christ's people had been doing what they were supposed to do, none of this would have happened. Now, many of the arguments against God and the Bible that we hear today were actually popularized by Voltaire. Let me hear if you've ever heard of this one. Jesus was never really God. He was just a good man, and later on they made him God. This is a quote from him. Christians spent 3 whole centuries in constructing, little by little, the apotheosis, that is, the raising to the status of God of Jesus. At first, Jesus was regarded as merely a man. He was inspired maybe by God, but then he was a creature better than others. Sometime after that, he was given a place above the angels, as St. Paul says. And of every day, they added more and more until he became an emanation of God, manifested in time. But still, that was not enough. He was held to be born before time, and finally, he was God, consubstantial with God. You ever heard that argument before? It's a classic atheist argument, right? That Jesus wasn't really God. We made him into God later. There are many of those arguments. In fact, Voltaire was also very clever. He basically would put out there, like, I agree with so much of the teaching of the Bible. It's just the supernatural stuff that's in the way, you know? And that happens today too. People tell people about Jesus's teachings, right? But don't tell them about the feeding the 5,000. That just gets in the way of belief. We hear that from people still today. And a lot of those early attacks, a lot of that stuff, that higher criticism would almost develop completely from this line of thinking, started with Voltaire. And now Voltaire he would attack atheists. He always said he was an atheist. I personally am not so sure. I wonder if he attacked atheists just to kind of defend himself. But he said he was never an atheist. He said atheists are just dumb. There has to be a God. I just don't think it's the Christian God. I just don't think Jesus Christ is that God. Voltaire believed that in his day he was living in, quote, the twilight of Christianity, the ending days, the closing sun of Christianity, in a lot of ways during Christianity's height, in some ways at France. However, he was correct. And he also said every sensible man, every honorable man must hold the Christian religion in horror. Now, Voltaire was not the only philosopher in this part of France or Europe who was doing this. Rousseau is over in Geneva writing very similar things at the same time. And there are other people that we will quote too who are very much against Christianity. But why I really focus on Voltaire is because he became so popular. Voltaire was more than just a writer. In fact, he realized early on the publishers make most of his money when you write books. And he also worried he would be censored. And he worried that if I'm censored and I'm poor, I'm going to change what I write to make more money. And he didn't want to do that. At one point, he has to flee. He insulted a man, and this guy beat him up. Voltaire began taking fencing classes to avenge his honor and challenge this guy to a duel. But the family of the man who threatened him found out. He ended up going to jail at one point. Then he flees to England. It's all very confusing. But he ends up in England, and while he's there, he learns how to invest money in ships for trade, and he begins to make a ton of money doing that. He becomes a very successful businessman, saying, hey, that ship goes to India to trade stuff. I'm not sure what you trade to India, but whatever it is you trade, I want to put some money down, and when it comes back, pay me for part of that money, right? And he made a lot of money doing that. And in England, he also saw England at the time had a free press. You could write whatever you wanted. And he went, wow, this is amazing. Why doesn't France have this? I'm going to go do everything I can to get France like this because it's messed up that France doesn't have this. Over the years, he also became friends with very wealthy men. And if you're the wealthy guy and you like to sin and you live in this kind of quasi sort of Christian, sort of not Christian world of France, you liked people like Voltaire, and specifically 2 guys known as the Paris brothers, very wealthy, became his friends and would help go in on businesses with him. By his 40s, he was a millionaire, and no one could tell him what to publish. He could write whatever he wanted because he didn't care if the publishers made money. He was fine. And he would travel around Europe. Literally, the number of countries he would go to and become a part of their court and then flee off to another country, it was several of them. I mean, more than most people in their lifetime. He would run around Europe for decades, getting into the court of Geneva, the court of Prussia, this, that, and the other. And eventually, he ends up back in France. But the whole time he's writing to France. He's writing articles. He's writing things, getting them published, becoming very popular for a guy who's not living there. He writes books like Candide, and he wrote plays, too. He wrote several plays. People loved his plays. They thought they were so witty and smart because he knew just how to attack the system, just how to attack the Pope and the priests and France without getting in trouble. So you could laugh, you could have a good time, and it's just jokes. It's just fun. Come on, Voltaire's not that bad. While he was getting his message out, he was very, very good at that. He spent 3 decades away from Paris, but after 30 years in 1778, he returned to Paris, and he was a rock star. He was a celebrity. They loved him. They celebrated him. People were selling Voltaire merchandise, like pictures of him on shirts kind of thing. I don't think they had maybe pictures of shirts, but they were selling merchandise of his. And with quotes and stuff. They went crazy for him. And the church even came to him when he got there and said, hey, if you'll just deny your anti-God materials, we want to honor you. We want to make you like an honorary guy and give you some awards. We just can't with all your anti-God stuff. And Voltaire said, no, I'm not going to do that. I stand by every word I said. If you want to honor me, but I'm not changing a thing I said. When he died, he was added to the French pantheon, and it was somewhat, in some ways, seems like it was almost created for him, where they put him as one of the great figures of all France's history. Napoleon III, not the Napoleon Bonaparte you're thinking of, but his grandson or grandnephew, I think it is actually, had his heart removed and brought to a museum in Paris so that they could be had. And the guy who embalmed him actually took his brain out and kept it out as like family thing. They had the brain of Voltaire for like 100 years. And then eventually the guy that family guy who had the brain of Voltaire traded it for seats at the opera. And he got 20 years worth of seats for trading that brain in to a museum or something. Very strange. So that's Voltaire. And the reason I quote him is because one woman said at the time he was the greatest celebrity of Europe. Yet so much of his reputation, so much of his popularity was, I don't like the church. I don't like God, and I'm against this. And the fact that a man like that would be considered so popular, at least among the elites, tells you where they're at, right? You know, I was showing a list of my students, the top Billboard songs and who were the singers and stuff like this the other day. And one of my students made the point, he said, you don't ever see Christian music at the top of those billboards, do you? And I said, no. He said, that kind of tells you that we're not the billboard people, the people listening to music are not very Christian. I was like, I think that's very true. What you're listening to, what's popular is somewhat, because of reverse, if the top Billboard 100 was Amazing Grace, followed by, As Can It Be, and some of the others, if it was all songs we sing in church, right? That would tell you something about those people. The fact that they're all almost anti-God songs, that tells you a different story, doesn't it? And that's kind of the situation Voltaire's in. The fact that a guy would be this popular, he'd be this famous, that he'd be this big before the revolution happens, tells you where the heart and spiritual thoughts of France and in a lot of ways Europe, but especially France, was at that time. It really demonstrates where they feel. They are against the church and they are against God. And what's about to happen in France, even though he dies in 1778, 11 years before the revolution truly kicks off, but what's about to happen in France is this anti-God sentiment. And the reason I think we struggle to really understand the French Revolution and care about the French Revolution is because that part of it has been obscure to us, that this was a giant move against God and the church. And when you don't have that peace, to me, I understood that piece. I said, this revolution makes way more sense. It wasn't random. It wasn't just mobs. It was an anti-God and anti-church movement. Now, that's not to say there weren't people who were fighting for God and fighting for the church in this movement. There were some people looking around going, look, I'm not signing up on all that, okay? I am still Catholic. But you will see that that is not the majority in this situation. Voltaire was extremely popular. Another French philosopher, Diderot, was quoted saying, man will never be free until the last king is strangled with the entrails of the last priest. So that's a lot of hate for God and the priest, right? The last king must be strangled with the intestines of the last priest. Another, Baron de Holbach, as I said, I'm not French. A religion has ever filled the mind of man with darkness and kept him in ignorance of the real duties of true interests. It is only by dispelling these clouds and phantoms of religion that we shall discover truth, reason, and morality. Religion diverts us from the cause of evil and from the remedies which nature prescribes. Far from curing, it aggravates, multiplies, and perpetuates it. Now, you have these kinds of people saying things like this, and then you have a revolution right afterwards. You got to know this was a part of it, and this definitely was a big part of it. Now, these are just some of the feelings. We could keep going on and on, but I think you get the idea. There's a large movement here against God. Now, I'm going to try to sideswipe the confusing aspects of the French Revolution. It's impossible to completely sideswipe it. It reminds me of England's Glorious Revolution. There's Civil War they had. There's just certain things that happen, and you kind of go, okay, this is really confusing. What's going on? Especially, I don't know if it's because I'm an American. I don't live in America, but I'm from America, and we just don't have all these kings and queens and families and stuff. To me, this doesn't quite really just add up in how you do things. But I get lost when you start naming these things. And with the French Revolution, there's a national convention, there's a tennis court assembly, there's all these different things happening, and I'm going to skip most of that. That's not because that's not what we're here to do. We're looking at what's going on with the church and what's going on with the government, and that's where we're going to really take our focus and be at. The first thing that they do in 1789, they begin overthrowing the government. And in 1789, that one of the first things the new French government does is it immediately eliminates the tithing of the Catholic Church. Now, I looked in multiple places, and maybe I just couldn't find it, but I could not figure out, was the Catholic Church tithing, like forcing you to pay 10%, or were they just collecting tithe? Like everywhere I read, it was like they just collected a tithe. But I think it was actually on some level forced by the power of government, because the Catholic Church was very powerful. They owned 10% of the lands of France, and they were collecting a tithe on top of that. And you couldn't tax them. You couldn't do anything about it. That made them a very powerful force, and the businesses and things the priests got involved in, you couldn't touch. Well, they immediately began confiscating all of that land. The tithe was over, and all of that land was now taken by the government, and you could not interfere with them. And now one thing they did say that we as moderns might like was they said, hey, the church no longer has power of censorship. Say what you want to say. Everything is tolerated now. They can't force you to have any religious beliefs. And most of us would say, that seems good, right? We shouldn't have a group of people controlling everyone's speech. At the same time, though, they're confiscating all of the church's lands that had been maybe government protected up until that point. But all at once, it's gone. Now, in 1790, they started to pass a much more strict set of rules to rein in the Catholic Church. Now, even though there was a lot of anti-Catholic sentiment, the average peasant still liked the Catholic Church, especially like the elites in Paris had their view. But if you were living out in the middle of nowhere as a farmer, the Catholic Church was everything to you. And so when you see this revolution happening, you see these things happening in Paris, you're not happy about it. And there's actually going to be a big revolt that happens against some of this stuff, because they're like, hey, we're not with you, Paris. You're doing this on your own. It wasn't just Paris, but the major cities, especially Paris. Now, at least on paper, the law of 1790 was just to control the Catholic Church's power. But it immediately was turned into a law that harmed the church. And what they basically said was, here's the things you can do, here's the things you can't do. Oh, and you have to pledge to sign your fealty, your loyalty to the French government. You're no longer working for the Catholic Church. We're starting like a new Catholic Church. You're still Catholic, but you're under our control now. Well, the Catholic priests didn't want to sign that, because they're like, hey, I answer to Rome, I answer to the Pope. And if you're a Protestant, you're going, you shouldn't answer to any of them. I understand. I'm with you on that, right? I'm also with you. But anyway, they're going, hey, I don't want to answer to the French government. I've promised to serve Rome. Here's one of the quotes from this document. Before the ceremony of consecration begins, the bishop-elect shall take a solemn oath in the presence of the officers, of the people, and of the clergy to guard with care the faithful of his diocese who are confided to him, to be loyal to the nation, the law, and the king, and to support with all his power the Constitution decreed by the National Assembly and accepted by the king. So you see, he must now be loyal to the nation. France comes first, and you can no longer serve God even. Did you notice there's no God there? You're serving God second to serving France. And many of the priests saw that and said, no, I'm not going to sign that. That's absolutely silly. I won't sign that I serve France before God. I won't sign that I serve France before the Pope. I'm not going to sign I serve France before the church. I love France maybe, but I'm not signing that. Well, this immediately got you suspected. You were now immediately in trouble, and your salary just got revoked. France is not going to pay for you if you won't sign this document. And you had to now come to court. And they suspected everybody who wasn't with them of being a traitor. In 1792, the French government began to come up with new ways to kind of get it. They want it on to the public. They will tell you, hey, the church needs to be reined in. But in private, it was also, we're fighting wars with a bunch of countries right now during the French Revolution. And France's churches are sitting on a lot of money. How can we get some of that money? They literally, one of them said like, hey, they're sitting on 100 million livres. Now, I don't know what that is in French money back then, but it must have been a lot, because they were like, how can we get some of that? All priests were now in this new law set up as you are automatically suspect of being a counter-revolutionary, of being against the revolution if you are a priest by virtue. And if you don't sign this pledge, we automatically suspect you of hurting us. During the French Revolution, there was a counter-revolution where people tried to fight back. It was unsuccessful, but it did cause problems, and France was in the middle of wars with other countries. France didn't have time to deal with the counter-revolution happening inside, and they saw the priests as a big part of that problem. And to be fair, I'm sure some of the priests were against what France was doing and were a part of that counter-revolutionary movement. So, maybe to give some credit to the French Revolution, that was probably a fair assessment that some priests were doing that. In September of 1792, specifically, a time period called the September Massacres, priests were highlighted as groups to be killed. 3 high-ranking bishops were killed in front of the crowd, followed by 200 more priests were done so. They were not alone. These were just some of the members of the September Massacres. In Lyons, they had priests executed by the hundreds by drowning. In Roquefort, they were putting them in prison to suffer. All over the place, they were beginning to turn on and kill priests because they were seen as working for the other side. And they were also, not just priests, nuns as well were being drowned for simply the act of being a nun, being a priest. If you won't agree to sign our pledge, you must be working for the enemies. This got even worse in 1793. The law of suspects were passed. Now, even if you sign the pledge, we still don't trust you until you prove your loyalty to us. If you're a priest, you can be suspected and killed at any moment. You didn't even really have to go to trial. We suspect you as a priest. By just being a priest, you must be a bad person. They also began to destroy all of the church bells across France. All of those big bells, gone. Crosses, gone. Altars, gone. Anything that was an outward sign of worshiping Christianity, gone. If you did that, that was a sign you were counter-revolutionary and you were making yourself suspicious and you could be killed. On top of that, all of the statues, all of the icons, anything possibly related to Christianity had to be destroyed because it was a sign you were working against the revolution. Now in Paris, this was done with gusto and the full support of the people. Now, there were some people who were appalled, but many of them they were on board with this. But I told you, the people in the countryside of France, not so on board. They saw this happening and they did not like it. In fact, they were already bothered by the fact that the king was getting killed. Maybe they didn't like the king, maybe they didn't like the oppression, but they really weren't on board with this whole rejecting God thing. A short time later, France continued to reject everything God. And one of the ways just to show you how anti-God they were, they replaced the calendar. They said, nah, we don't like the calendar anymore. They put new months in. They changed the way they told, when we do a week, we do 7 days. They said, that's Christian. We're going to make our weeks 10 days. And the 10th day will be a day you celebrate and rest. We don't want that Christian day. We got new months. They replaced the names of the months. They also replaced, how we have 0, that first year, the year of the Lord, that our entire calendar is built, BC before Christ, AC, Anno Domini, I think it is. But it's the Latin. Anyway, the new 0 is the beginning of the French Revolution, and every year afterwards is since the French Revolution. They're completely rewriting everything, and it's also they're very obsessed with tens and dividing things by tens. We'll get into that a little bit more when we start a cult of tens that we're going to talk about. But this is when the metric system is created. So if you use the metric system, you're using a cultically obsession with 10. That was created by the French Revolution to overthrow God. So I'm just saying, my European listeners, my Australian listeners, guys, come on, let's not do that. Okay, no, I'm just kidding. But no, this is when they created the metric system and this whole division by 10 thing. Well, they put it into their calendar too because they're trying to get rid of anything that reminds them of God. And there is no Sunday. It's the 10th day you rest now. On top of that, a lot of their stuff was working. 50% of the priests of France signed their pledges. They rejected the old ways. They became servants of the revolution, and they were called the abjuring pastors, and they had to now do whatever the French state wanted. When we talk about what's about to happen, many of these people running these things are going to be these priests that signed pledges. But if 50% of them did it, that means 50% of them did not do it. They were called the refractory, and if you found them, you would kill them if you could. If you housed them, this guy used to live at the parish, he has to all go on the lam, a faithful parishioner brings them in to give him some food. Now you can be killed because you helped these guys who aren't going to sign the pledge. And they begin to do these anti-priestly parades. The Archbishop of Paris, who signed the pledge, was forced to replace his priestly garb with like a new garb of France's liberty. They gave him a new cap. The bishops wear the kind of funny looking hats. Well, they gave him a new cap, a cap of liberty, they said. And he was forced to lead a procession of anti-church paraders through the streets to cleanse the streets and to reestablish this new anti-religious atmosphere. All the street names that once had religious connotations, maybe Joan of Arc Avenue or, Augustine Boulevard, whatever, gone. Replace them with someone else. All the cities that had religious names, like if it was a city named after a religious, gone. Replace it with something else. They are undoing anything that can possibly be related to Christianity and God. They are not going to go down that direction anymore. They couldn't stand anything religious or Christian. They pushed it all through, and they began to adopt what would be called the cult of reason. This was their first attempt at replacing Christianity. They wanted a non-religious, deistic, it was really atheist, new religion to replace Christianity. You were forced to pledge allegiance to reason, the idea of reason itself. And it's very strange. Like, how do you do that? I will worship reason. Reason's not an entity. It's nothing. I pledge allegiance to reason, but how do you even do that? And yet that's what they forced people to do. And they would now not always reason. Some of the churches that quote unquote churches that were coming would worship liberty or nature or victory. And you could worship all four of those ideas or more, but you also had to have reason. And it was atheistic. I mean, this is clearly there is no God. They replaced the holidays in the country. But the people resisted. Look, we've always had these holidays. We like Christmas. What are you doing? And the priests of the old order, the ones that signed the pledges, now came in to do these new religious services where they, had once given communion. They were now giving services to reason, to victory, to nature. And in some of the country towns, the people wouldn't have it. They forced them. They were like, we're going to kill you if you don't give us communion. Like, we need communion. What are you doing? And that's just something I find kind of, I don't want to say funny, but like it is kind of funny, right? Like, if you don't give us communion, we'll kill you. Get rid of your that reason stuff, right? Now, funny in retrospect, I should say. I'm sure at the time it was not. At least 16 churches that were big, famous churches of Paris were not closed down, but they were replaced and turned into temples of reason. Here they would throw festivals of reason. And again, all of this is worshiping this idea, this vague concept of reason. The biggest of these was in November of 1793. They had it at the famous church site Notre Dame, famous for the Hunchback of Notre Dame. No, I'm just kidding. It's obviously a big famous site in France. And they tore the altar down that was sitting in that church, and they inscribed on this broken altar to philosophy. They then built this kind of hill, paper mache mountain with flowers on it. It's very unclear what they built. It seems to be some kind of high place, if I'm honest, based on my understanding of the Old Testament. Inside the middle of it, they decorated it with flowers. They put like Roman Greek pillars around it. And they had these women, and you would come in, and there were these in this festival, and there were these women dressed in like Roman looking garbs of all white, and they would be kind of moving, swaying, dancing back and forth. And in the middle was this woman who was dressed as the goddess. This is a quote: "The goddess of liberty impersonating reason itself." What does that mean? I don't know. You can look up pictures of it. It's a very strange sight. And these people would come in, and there was a fire on the broken altar, the new altar, with to philosophy written on it. And the fire was symbolic of truth. And to avoid, because they didn't want to hey, are you guys just pagans? No, we're not pagans just because we're dressing up as Romans, because we're not using statues, they said. Look, you worship statues if you're a pagan. These are real women dancing, and a woman that we're worshiping. We know she's standing in for the person of goddess of reason, or liberty of reason. So it's not paganism, okay? It doesn't count. It's not a statue. That's how they kind of got around it. However, there's more to it than just that too, guys. There's a very sexual component, because these women were dressed provocatively, and the goddess of liberty, of reason herself, people in the crowd said, whoo, that she is dressed provocatively and dancing inappropriately. But the people also were like, this is great. We love it. This is so much fun. Church has never been more fun. But then other people were going, this is lurid. This is gross. This is lewd. Is this really what France is becoming now? Is this what we're going to do? And I mean, it's easy at this point to start to glaze over and go, okay, France is weird. Imagine your churches. Imagine your home. Imagine they take over your church, your pastor's on the run, or maybe even in prison, and you show up at church and they're throwing a festival of reason, and they've built this giant mountain and they have women dancing all over it provocatively. Imagine how that would make you feel, and imagine how disturbing that would be as the crowd cheers and celebrates it. And you would be going, oh, what's wrong with everybody? Are we okay with this? Why? This is horrible. And that's what's going on in France at this time. And I look at that and I go, wow, it would have been really horrible if you were a faithful person watching all of this go down. And why they threw this giant celebration, and they had several of them, but this was the biggest one, was in Notre Dame. The people of the revolution were destroying tons of lives. According to the Institute of World Politics, you could, and others as well, you could make an argument that the French Revolution was causing basically a mini genocide, a mini Holocaust, by killing its own people that disagreed with it. And you're going, oh, is this like the guillotine stuff, a Robespierre? No, actually. Even before that happened, some of the people in the countryside began to rise up. And about 20% of the population of an area called Vendée, the Vendeans, will be killed by the French soldiers coming in and wiping them out. About 170,000 of them will be killed. This was a conservative group of people, and this was not the only one, where they basically said, hey, we're not on board with this whole Paris thing. We're not on board with this cult of reason stuff. We're not on board with any of this. And now France was conscripting their sons to go die in a war to protect France while France was going crazy. And they said, we don't want to do this. We're going to stand up to you, France. Like, this is out of control. They were French, but they didn't agree with it. A quote one of them said at the time was, they have killed our king, chased away our priests, sold the goods of our church. They eat everything we have. They want to take our bodies now? No, do not let them. And so these people feel utterly betrayed. They feel what France is doing is awful. They've destroyed king. They're taking away God. They're taking away their church. They're stealing their food. Wasn't that the whole point? Was that the French Revolution would see food go to everyone? Well, they can't even eat now. Well, Paris sent a general of soldiers, and they would eventually be called the Infernal Troops. And they just went around setting fire to the crops, killing women and children and men that they found. Everyone they found was a traitor. Even people who were on their side who would run up to them and be like, I'm loyal to Paris. I've been helping you out. I've been giving information. They said, no, kill him. If you were really loyal to us, you wouldn't still be here. And they killed almost 200,000 people. And many historians have said this should be claimed as one of the first true modern genocides because it was so systematic in what they did. Back to the Temple of Reason. So keep in mind, while Paris is doing this weird, provocative dancing stuff, out in the countryside, the people resisting are getting killed. They're having their farms burnt down and they're being massacred. And it really puts in perspective how dark what they're doing is. Back to the Temples of Reason. They're continuing their strange Greek-inspired festivals, building these mountains of dirt inside of them that they would put, like, they're literally building like high places from biblical times, and they would cover it with Greek and Roman statues. They were doing these sexual, disturbing, provocative dances. And finally, someone in France goes, I've had enough of this. And you go, okay, good. Somebody's about to fix this, right? Well, the person who decides to fix this is a man named Robespierre. If you've ever heard of him, you know that he is famous in the French Revolution for being the guy who uses the guillotine to kill a bunch of people. And he's famous for a time period called the Reign of Terror. Not necessarily good that he's the guy who's going to deal with the situation. He hated the cult of reason. He said, this is not good. Atheism is not good. We are not going to become an atheist nation. But he quoted Voltaire saying, Voltaire once said, if man had no God, they'd have to invent one. And he said, see, it's bad to have atheism. And you're like, okay, he's right. He goes, so let's invent a new God. That's basically what he does. You know, oh, that's not what we want to do. And Robespierre thought, man needs God to be moral. We're people who need God, but the cult of reason won't give us what we need. So he created a new cult called the cult of the Supreme Being. Not God, guys, the Supreme Being. It almost reminds me of like the atheists when they created the flying spaghetti monster or stupid stuff like that. And you're like, okay, that's dumb. This is what the cult of the Supreme Being. Like, I don't believe in God. I believe in the Supreme Being. Okay, you believe in God. In this religion, you had to believe in God, a godlike creature, and you had to believe humans had an immortal soul that could be judged. You're like, okay, that's good. That's closer to Christianity. And everything else was Roman and Greek. Oh, no, we didn't get there at all. That was it. You know, and we're Christians. We believe you have to believe in Jesus Christ, comes and dies for your sins. You have to believe God created the world. We believe in the inerrant word of Scripture. We believe Christ is coming back again, right? We believe all that. None of that's accepted. Just believe in God, believe in the Supreme Being, believe the soul is immortal. Well, then what do you do? How do you become a good person? Good question. You become a good person by serving your nation. And civic duties make the gods happy, and if you do them, you will be moral. So, serve France faithfully. France needs you, and you need to be civic-minded. That's the new religion. And I hear that and I go, man, that's lame. But there are other, cultic religions like that. Mormonism has a little bit of that going on too, right? Robespierre's moment, he has a big moment, guys. This gets big. He creates an entire, this moment when he creates the cult of the supreme being is the height of his power. You hear, if you look at the history books, I literally taught this subject. They didn't mention any of this stuff. And they were like, when he killed a bunch of his enemies, that was the height of his power. No. When he created the cult of supreme being, that was the height of his power. He chose the day that used to be the celebration of Pentecost. And he's like, that's the kickstart of my new religion. He wanted a big festival, like the festivals of reason, to really kick it off. And similar to the festival of reason, but it's now going to be outside, not inside the old churches. They're going to use those old churches still, but the first festival needs to be outside. And he even moved the guillotine. He said the guillotine's been in the middle of Paris, but the sounds of people getting beheaded might distract us from the festival. So he didn't stop beheading people. They had too many people to behead to stop beheading people. He just moved it outside of town so that wouldn't distract you from the festival he was about to show off, right? So he has a new religion. He's got all these new ideas. They're still going to kill people, but it's over there. And it starts on a beautiful day, sunny day, June 8th. He leads a large procession of people through the streets of Paris. All the girls have roses in their hair. The men are carrying wreaths. They're going to drop them off in the park. Everyone's joyous. Everyone's happy. Robespierre is overjoyed. He can't stop giving speeches on brotherhood, freedom, liberty, victory. And then they leads them all to this park in the middle of Paris where there's a giant man-made mountain, even bigger than all their other ones. And it's got flowers, it's got stuff, but on top of that mountain that they made in the middle of this park, this big hill, there's a giant tree, the tree they call the tree of liberty, right? And everyone sees it, and next to it's a pillar with a statue of a woman, Lady Liberty or something like that's there. And the crowd is loving it. Robespierre gets up, he's wearing bright blue, almost priestly-looking garbs, and he gives this big speech where he says atheism was wrong, the cult of reason's no good. And then he picks up a flame and he walks it over to a giant, ugly cardboard statue. He says, this is atheism. He throws the flame on the cardboard statue. The statue begins to burn and melt, and underneath is a beautiful statue of a woman. And he goes, that's wisdom, the goddess of wisdom. And the crowd's going wild. They love it. Oh, man. This is such a show. They love this stuff. People in Paris love theater. They love a show. And they're loving it. Robespierre is working the crowd. However, Robespierre does notice some of his other leaders are snickering at him. They're kind of like, this is stupid. He didn't hear this quote, but one of them will be quoted, what? It's not enough that he's in charge of the nation. Now he's got to be God too, right? Like they're not loving it. And he takes note of that. Like he looks at them and he kind of like, I see you. I see that you're not enjoying this. And I'm going to remember that. 500,000 people are at this festival, seeing all of this, seeing the mountain, seeing the Tree of Liberty, seeing all of this, seeing the speeches given by Robespierre and the other people. They sing revolution songs. They chant "Viva la Revolution," "Viva Robespierre." They are enjoying it. It's all, and then after the speeches, after burning the statue, right after they do all that, they go and enjoy Greek and Roman style athletic competitions and cheer all day long, watching an early version of the Olympics, I guess, here, of at least France competition, because that's what the Greeks and Romans did. They wrestled, they ran races, and so that's what we're going to do too, because we're going to worship the supreme being and we're going to be athletic. Robespierre, everyone who saw Robespierre said, I think this is the happiest day of his life. We don't have Robespierre's exact quote, but I'm pretty sure it was based on every account. He could not have been happier. 2 days later, Robespierre introduces a law to speed up the trials and executions. You see, we have too many people in prison. It's overcrowding. We need to deal with the overcrowding prison problem. We're going to start executing people a lot quicker. Your trials are basically not going to happen anymore. We're going to do this really fast. Oh, and also, some of my leaders, we think, have been conspiring against me, Robespierre. And so we're going to start searching them. He would threaten them all the time, these leaders, with, I know that you're conspiring against me, and I know who they are. But I won't tell you, because then you'll try to stop me. And his leaders, the other leaders, were terrified of him. They would get caught in the middle of the night, taken to jail, and by the next morning, they would already be getting guillotined. It would happen so fast that leaders wouldn't sleep in their own beds. They would hide in servant quarters beds and stuff, just maybe the hope, or other people's houses, hoping that if they came for him and to arrest him, you wouldn't find him there because he was sleeping somewhere else. That's how terrified they were. Within 6 weeks, less than a month and a half after Robespierre's big festival, Robespierre was arrested by the leaders trying to stop him from him executing them, basically. It was unclear how, but at some point while they were arresting him, Robespierre injured his face from, it seems, a bullet. Some people believe he tried to shoot himself. Other people believe that while he was resisting arrest, he got shot. And the reason I say that, because as they led him to the guillotine, he had a big bandage on his face. And at one point they will whip the bandage off and he will scream out in pain because this is a big bandage. Now at this time, the same people who saw him only a few weeks before declare this giant new cult, the cult of the Supreme Being, are now going to watch as he's led to the execution. And famously, there was a day where in our calendar, it was July 27th. But remember, they made up a new calendar. It was called Thermidorian or something 7. But anyway, he was supposed to give a defense, and he tried to get up and give a speech. Now, there's two versions of this, and I'll be honest with you, I can't tell which one's true. The version you may have heard of was it started raining. It stormed so bad that everyone inside, no one heard his speech. The crowd didn't support him. And so there was no one there to end his execution. Even famously, it said that he once believed the crowd would never let me be executed. They loved me too much, but the rain sent them home and he was executed. Another version says, no, I don't know if there was a storm. It was just that the mob was so loud, no one could hear him. Either way, he doesn't get his speech out there. The people don't hear it, whether it's a storm or the mob. It's too loud. He's not able to defend himself, so no one defends him. And the next morning, he is guillotined and he dies. His head is cut off in front of the same crowd that only 6 weeks before he had proclaimed a new religion too. After he dies, the cult of Supreme Being kind of falls apart. I mean, when your founder gets executed for treason against everyone, do you really want to be seen as supporting that? So everyone kind of backs up off that cult. Now, his cult was intersecting with another cult in France at the time. You're going, how many cults are in France? 5. We're going to talk about at least 5 of them. All right, so this is number 3. Weirdly, the death of Robespierre was predicted specifically by a woman who was sitting in jail by Robespierre's own hand at this time. Her name, Catherine Thiot. She had claimed she was a prophetess and she had a small cult following. She said she would be the mother of God and give birth to a new Messiah. She was arrested, but on her person when they arrested her was a prophecy she had written down saying Robespierre is the new John the Baptist and he will be beheaded like John the Baptist. And when he was beheaded, she was like, I told you so. Now, guessing that somebody was going to be beheaded in France is not exactly, it's not exactly winning the lottery, okay? That was happening everywhere. But she did correctly predict that the guy doing all the beheading was going to soon be beheaded like John the Baptist in her mind. Now, the Theotists saw this and were like, yeah, see, we proved it. But they were actually causing problems for Robespierre. It's part of the reason he got arrested. Within a week of him declaring his new religion, the Theotists came up and supported him. He liked them, but it made him look a little crazy. And this kind of began some of his troubles, having these people support him. And it was one of the reasons the people who didn't like him used it like, hey, you have those crazy Theotists following you around. You know, you're out of your mind kind of thing. No, I don't like them. Throw them in jail. That's why they put them in jail. Like, I'm not friends with theirs. See, I put them in jail, right? The disciples of Catherine Thiot were eventually acquitted and they all got to leave. However, while in jail, Catherine Thiot herself did die of just, illness or whatever. While in jail, she did not give birth to a new Messiah. So that prophecy did not come true. There you go. Now, after the death of Robespierre, things calmed down in France a little bit for a while, and some of the anti-Christians attacks softened a little bit. Some of the churches were kind of able to return, but not completely. And many of the priests were still being arrested and killed, but there was still a little bit of a return to things, just a tad. But a new cult was forming to take the place of the cult of the Supreme Being, and this was the Decadary cult. I think that's how you say it. And this was based on Deca. If you're noticing Deca, decameter, Deca is 10. And this was a cult of the 10 days. It's literally just kind of like called the 10-day cult. And it was basically, hey, on the 10th day, we celebrate and throw a party. And I got to be honest with you, I don't know what this cult stood for. I spent a while trying to find anywhere or anybody explained what this cult did. It was around for years, and nobody really knows. It seemed like it incorporated some of those civic ideas that the other cults had, but that's about all we know about it. It was a cult, and it had civic ideas, and it was all about 10 and the 10th day, and that's it. So there's this other cult out there. It's going to merge with the final cult that we're talking about. And then when I say cult, a cult makes you inspire like this idea of like a cult leader. This is not cult in that sense. This is like religion, basically. They're calling them cults, but they were the national. Each of these religions that we've talked about were endorsed, at least two of them, the cult of supreme being, the cult of reason, and the last one we talk about, were all endorsed by the French government as the official new religion. All the holidays were swapped. Everything was said, this is the new religion. So when I say cult, I don't mean like a man in a bunker. I mean like the entire government of France says, this is our new religion for a year or two at a time. And around the year 1798, the French armies captured Rome over in Italy. And at the time, they imprisoned the Pope. And they began to attack and kill priests of Rome, caused a bunch of problems. They renamed Rome the Roman Republic, and a French general was running this territory. And it only lasted about a year. The people of Rome did not like this or care for this. And the Pope that was taken to France, he was kind of put in prison. Then he was put in exile. Then he died trying to come back. Not a good thing. This did not make the French or the Italian people happy. And the army, I mean, if you're a French Catholic and you've been kind of hiding out, that your government just killed the Pope. You didn't kill him, but you basically caused him to die, not making you happy at all. This army will be swept out of Rome a year later by an Austrian-Russian army alliance. I didn't realize the Russians ever got as south as Italy. However, a year later, Napoleon will come back in the year 1800 and reestablish dominance. But unlike the old army, he will not attack and destroy the church and all those problems. He will curry favor with the Catholic Church there. But there's just one more aspect. The reason I brought this up, it's not maybe directly related to what we're talking about, but it's just another aspect where this French Revolution was not only causing problems in France, but it was causing problems for the religious worship of people in Italy. I mean, the people of Italy are like, we have a pope. You just stole our pope. What's going on, France? Like, this thing is going everywhere. If France had not been stopped or Napoleon had not come in, how much would they have been able to get away with? How long would this have gone on? I mean, it was really changing the way things are done. Now, after the cult of the Decadary, which is, a cult of tens, a new group comes in and kind of merges with the Decadary, but takes over the Decadary. This was called the Theophilanthropy cult. Philanthropy. Now, if you remember, I mentioned a man at the very beginning of this called Thomas Paine and his terrible anti-God work. Well, Thomas Paine actually was one of the founders of this in 1794. He asked Robespierre, and Robespierre kind of gave his blessing to start a new church with Rousseauian ideas, all combined to create this new church. Now Robespierre was busy making the cult of the supreme being, but he gave Paine and these guys permission to start their own new religion, gave them a small church, and once the cult of the supreme being fell apart, this church began to really take on. And one of the things that was interesting about this church was all the other ones were like, we're doing something new that's never been done before. But the Theophilanthropists said, no, we're not doing something new. We're doing something old. We're going back. Christianity is the aberration. Christianity was the new ideas that messed it up. We're going to go to the final religion, which is actually the original religion. Each religion before this was like, we're going to replace Christianity. And the Theophilanthropists said, no. We're going to create the religion, the final religion, the last religion that the whole world will worship this religion. And it's actually the original religion. We've just been deviating from it this whole time. And so here's a quote from them. We do not propose to the people a new religion or a new worship. Our religion is the universal religion. We can trace back our religion and worship to the first ages of the world. Now that's very effective. If you tell people, hey, I'm not bringing you a new idea that no one's ever heard before. I'm bringing you an old way of worshiping, even older than Christianity. When you have all this chaos of France is going through, new religion, someone coming in and saying, no. We're going back to something firm and old. It reached a lot of people. In fact, this was the one of those religions that France will enforce. This is the one that actually began to win over the people a bit. In 1794, they were only given that one church, but by 1798, they had the cult of the Decadary is joining with them because this is going to clearly be a very powerful force in the land for religion. And unlike the previous cults, it was resonating with people. And part of it was just the way they did it all. Instead of forcing people on it, they actually made it seem appealing. Inside the religious system, there were two committees that ruled over everything. One was the Committee of Spirituality. It dealt with religious questions. The other one was the Committee of Temporal, which would deal with things happening around you, and they would try to help you if you needed help. After all, one of their civic duties was to help other people. Their beliefs were similar to the other cults. God is real and souls are immortal. And that here's their entire religious system. Here's their philosophy. Anything that benefits man is good, and you are supposed to do that. And it's moral of you to do things that benefit mankind. Anything that harms people is bad and evil, and you don't do that. And if you're not sure what these things are, speak to the committees, and they will help arbitrate your problems. They said every morning you wake up, give a short allegiance to God, a little prayer saying, God, I'm yours. And that night when you go to bed, examine your conscience and ask yourself, did I do anything wrong? Did I do anything evil? Was I good? Was I as good as I should have been? And then if you made some mistakes, figure out how you can do better tomorrow. You had an altar that they would have in their places of worship, but the altar was for laying flowers and food on, little small sacrifices to beautify and say like, hey, I remember you, God. This was supposed to be a festival, like a church, like unlike the giant festivals of reason, these giant mountain things. This was supposed to be a small religion that you did at home that changed your life at home. It was the opposite of the giant festivals of reasons. It was supposed to be simple, that anyone could do it. You would come together on the 10th day or whatever day they came together, and you would sing songs and hymns, but they weren't to God necessarily. They were more like virtue hymns, like bravery is good, courage is great, that kind of stuff. They would have festival days, but instead of festival days to saints or Christmas, they would do festivals to Rousseau and Socrates and other philosophers. I'm sure Voltaire had one too. They would give sermons. You'd have a guy get up and give a speech, but it was almost always just a political speech. Like he'd get up and go, hey, here's the politics of the day, and here's why somebody's immoral. And they would argue immoral ideas. But in a lot of ways, though, it really did look like a church. And it was a really effective replacement of the Catholic Church. It was, and some people actually said that one of the guys who helped invent it was himself came from a Calvinistic background, a Puritan background of England. And many people were basically saying this is almost like, when historians look at it, it's like in a lot of ways this looks like Puritanism. On the outside, at least, the very simple, plain clothes, coming together. What did I do bad? What did I do good? It's almost like, well, at least the caricature of what Puritanism is. We like read, Scarlet Letter. This is almost what this feels like on the outside. Now, on the inside, there's no Jesus, there's no Christ, there's no hymns to God. It's very different. But on the outside, the simple life, hard work, that kind of thing they're seeing. Now, the Theophilanthropists, one of the famous things they did was they gave a funeral rite. When George Washington died, they gave a funeral for him. Like, hey, we love George Washington, and we think he's great. But secretly, the real funeral was actually like an oration praising Napoleon. Like, he's a strong up-and-comer, and the world will remember him for his courage and ability to lead military. Like, everything they said about George Washington, you could easily have applied to Napoleon. And they were trying to earn favor with Napoleon because it was very clear at this point, Napoleon's about to take over. Well, it didn't work. When Napoleon takes over, he begins to allow the French Catholicism to come back. He gets a concordat, a thing written from the Pope, basically bringing Catholicism back in, and he puts an end to theophilanthropy. He also puts an end to the cult of the Decaduary Tens. He also, the people who are still worshiping the cult of the Supreme Being, no, you're not anymore. Oh, if you're still back in the original one, the cult of reason, no. All of that is over. No more of these cults. He's getting rid of all of that. He's saying it didn't work. France is unstable, and we need to get back to something stable. We're going to bring the Catholic Church back in, but it's going to be a controlled, much more controlled by France version. They're not going to be able to do whatever they want like before. We're going to bring the Catholic Church back in. You're going, okay. So did things get better? Not really. The damage had kind of already been done. One of the things that they did, the priests that signed the pledges, they forced them to marry and basically live without priests. Well, when Napoleon comes back over and goes, hey, priest, do you want to come back? Well, they were disqualified. 6,000 to 9,000 of them had signed the pledges, had given up on God, and had married. They couldn't come preach it. They couldn't come back. Another 30,000 priests had been exiled. They're gone, and they're not coming back to France. Maybe some of them do, but a lot of them are gone. You don't even know where they are anymore. And not to mention the hundreds they had executed, thousands they had executed of nuns and priests. So although Napoleon said, okay, Catholics, you can come back out, a lot of the Catholics were gone. There were nobody to run those churches. Maybe some of them came back, but a lot. And France is still a somewhat Catholic country to this day, but not really, because the damage was done. You couldn't really recover it. You had slain, persecuted, and for 11 and 12 years attacked everything Catholic, and regardless of whether or not you were bringing it back in, that had an effect. That was a powerful effect on the people People were scared to be associated with it. I remember when I lived in Cambodia, there was the Khmer Rouge happened, 40, 50 years ago. And one of the things they did is they went after anybody who was dressed smart or rich or wealthy. And if you wore glasses, they would kill you. Well, when I lived in Cambodia, it was very rare for us to see people over the age of 40 wearing glasses. And a lot of people would wear pajamas everywhere. And I remember we had a friend of ours from another Asian country, and they were like, why do the Cambodians wear pajamas? And we're like, because I think it's just that culture of like, look, it wasn't good here if you dressed fancy. So a lot of people just learned to dress not fancy. And that's kind of the same thing that happened in France. Like once you've had that much persecution of the major religion, the people changed. And I'm not saying that they didn't go back and forth on this, but by Easter of 1794, going back to the beginning, every church in France almost had been sold, dismantled, had their priests gone, and they had churches had been vandalized. You don't just recover from that quickly. And the people themselves had their faith shaken. If they believed in God, where was God during all of this? Why hadn't God protected his people? When the priests started to come back, there wasn't, the people weren't the same anymore. They had been caught up in either waves of attacking the church, or they watched as the church was attacked and no one had come to save them. And let's not forget, the church itself had not been perfect before this. The Catholic Church in France had done a terrible job of things, and many people thought maybe this is what they get. So what do we make of this for today? You listen to this whole episode and you go, okay, what is my takeaway? What do I walk away from this? Well, a few different thoughts for you that for me stand out. For starters, comparing the American Revolution and French Revolution, very different. I feel like this religious element for me really helped me to understand the French Revolution and why I've never really found it interesting. It's because we left out the most interesting part. They struggled with their relationship with God, and it made a difference. And it just, to me, there's so many historical events. World War I, if you didn't know the Woodrow Wilson element where he tries to create this treaty of the Covenant of the League of Nations and tries to bring world peace for God, it's an important part of what was World War I, wasn't it? We don't know that. It leads part of the story out. So much of our history, so many of our stories, the second bloodiest event in human history, the Taiping Rebellion, is this wild event caused by a guy who thought he was Jesus' brother. Just so much of history is changed because people are interacting with God. And the French Revolution is not different. When the people of the French Revolution began to reject God, they did all these crazy things. And part of the reason it's so crazy is because they couldn't even figure out what religion they were going to be. And that leads me to thought number 2. They tried atheism. If anybody had a shot at making atheism work, it was the French. They hated the church. They hated the Christian God, especially the elites. But they couldn't make it work at all. It just didn't come together. They could not figure out what to worship. So then they created these fake cults, the cults of the supreme being, and just none of it took. It wasn't doing what it was supposed to do, because you can't not worship anything. You have to have something that you worship. You are designed by God to worship. And if you don't worship God, you will worship something. And to all the atheists out there who go, if we just got rid of, religion and God, life would be better. Well, the French Revolution tried that, and it was horrible and bloody. And I'm not saying things are perfect before that, but it was horrible and bloody when the atheists took over. They did horrible things, and they immediately threw themselves into all kind of wild, weird sins. And the people who tried to make it work ended up, most of them executed for trying. It didn't work. Thomas Paine was wrong. The Age of Reason didn't come. It's been 200 years of quote unquote the Age of Reason, and we have not seen the world improved dramatically by these ideas. It doesn't work. Humans are created to worship something. And whether it's the French Revolution trying to replace God with the supreme being, or the theophilanthropy, whatever it is, reason itself, or, the stories of North Korea where they try to replace God and then they had to make themselves God because people have to worship something. You will either serve God or you will worship something else, but you will not worship nothing. And the French Revolution story shows all the intellectuals, all the brilliant, smart people thought they could create something and make something great if only they could get rid of the church. And instead, all these Voltaire, Rousseau, genius people go into history for creating one of the bloodiest messes in human history in the French Revolution, because they were struggling and they were ultimately fighting against God and they were not successful. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Revived Thoughts. I hope you enjoyed this kind of not a deep dive, but a look into the French Revolution and really the side of the French Revolution that I had just not heard that much before. I knew a little bit of this stuff, but I really didn't know about all the cults and the mountains they were building and all of that. I do suggest if you want to go on Google Images and look up, the mountains themselves are really weird and it is just odd that people did that. And it really reminds you of Old Testament stuff, right? Like Solomon building the high places again. It just is a very strange thing that they ran off to go do. I hope that you enjoyed some of this and got something from this. I don't have like a direct application for us today of like, and this is why we shouldn't, but it just is an interesting aspect. Yet another moment where history has been taught to us, I think, one way. And when you look at the religious side, you look at the church history side, you look at the side where man is dealing with God, you see a completely, not a different story, but a fuller fleshing out of what was really going on. And it just shows you how so many of these historical events, how so much of history is man interacting with either rejecting, embracing, or going against, or false teaching. But so much of what we understand and know is man and its relationship with God. History is so much just that. But oftentimes we get the secular, sterilized version of that story, and it just doesn't make sense. So anyway, this has been Troy, and this is Revived Thoughts, and I hope you enjoyed it.